Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. This week, we are celebrating our third birthday, which was on April 15th, along with our breaking the 150,000 download barrier a week earlier. Over this weekend, we're releasing 5 conversations from the main podcast recording session, in which Stephen Harrison, Jörn Schattenberg, Louise Campbell, and I recounted highlights from the last 3 years on the podcast and in the fatty liver community at large. These serve as companions to the 3 special conversations we released yesterday, each containing one of the interviews we conducted as part of this week's episode. This conversation starts with Louise Campbell sharing her overall view of the past 3 years, beginning with disappointment over the initial, albeit call it complete response letter. But, as she notes, this had a few benefits. Now we have improved drugs, we have an improved understanding of disease, and we have higher levels of patient mobilization. On that last point, she points to increased patient participation in clinical trials, not just as participants, but as contributors to trial design, as major advance. She then shifts to discuss nurse and allied provider education as an important area where we have seen growth but will need to see much more, given that these professionals will provide the frontline patient education support when we have therapies available. She feels her role representing that point of view and speaking for that community has been a privilege and opportunity, particularly on this podcast and other places where her voice and her perspective get through to industry. From here, we move to my comments about how much richer all of our knowledge has become over the time we've been doing this podcast. I also share favorite phrases from all of us that emerged in the podcast drinking game. And my last comment speaks to the idea that ordinal biopsy has cast a wider shadow over NASH than we realize and will be unpacking the implications of this for years. That comment leads Stephen to commend the FDA and EMA for the work they are doing, prodding industry and academia to provide deeper answers and look at data sets of multiple subpopulations from the outset in terms of testing, drug approvals, combination therapies, other elements of patient care. As he closes, he comments on the importance of NASH drugs in the entire constellation of metabolic diseases and, as he puts it, extrahepatic cancers or obesogenic cancers, major causes of death. Jörn Schattenberg notes the treatment will start slowly when drugs are approved and that we will learn over time how to use the tools and the drugs better. The conversation ends with Louise agreeing about the complexity of disease and how high our standards in fatty liver actually have become. Before we dive into this conversation, I want to thank the 3 sponsors of our celebration, Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, Novo Nordisk, and Inventiva Pharma, along with some of the patient advocacy organizations that have been supporters since we started the podcast, notably including the Global Liver Institute, NASH Knowledge, the Fatty Liver Foundation, and the Fatty Liver Alliance. Finally, I want to thank Louise Campbell, who joined me for all 3 interviews and has been with us since episode 4 of year 1, and Stephen Harrison and Jörn Schattenberg, our 2 other lead surfers who've been along throughout this 3-year journey. So, Louise, what's yours?
Louise Campbell.
I have to say I agree with the guys on everything on there, but I'll be a little bit more succinct. I think for me, the disappointment was obviously OCA not getting approval from the FDA or in that letter. And I think, yes, I wasn't on the episode that you discussed, but I did listen to that episode. The passion was clear. And I think the disappointment when we did do the episode with Donna and what it could mean for patients and that disappointment and how it might affect the clinical trials and people not wanting to participate, I think was well mitigated for following that. So although that was a negative, it has led to where we are coming from today. Better approvals, improved drugs, more information on OCA, and very few trials have a 10-year timeline to be able to look at those sort of side effects. I think also for me, it's about getting the information out there. I've seen the strength that Donna and other patient advocates that we've had on the programme bring and how that movement and patients are becoming involved in the clinical trial process, not only as purely the participants, but also to assist in the design, to assist in the dissemination, and to be real movers and shakers in that field. And I think for any area of disease investigation, that is something to be applauded, particularly because we're in the liver field. Also for me, having more nurses and more people look at allied health as conduits to the information, and also that we can deal with the information that we discuss on this podcast and it's relevant to our practice. It's relevant to our education because it will come into a conversation, even if it's only a snippet in a more lay interpretation. I do not come from a highly academic background, but I'm able to translate very well high volume, high details from academic studies into a way that's pertinent and implementable and understandable for patients, relatives from any background and educational level. That is the skill that we look at when we talk about targeting allied allied health and nurses specifically who are going to integrate and be the front of our sort of dissemination of these drugs to those patients. So to be able to get that voice out there and to try and use me as a conduit to get their voice in here, then I think I've enjoyed being party to that. And also I get letters that say, you're in my head when I go on my walk about what would Louise think about this. I have apologised to that person for being in their head for a start. But these are people within the industry, not only now looking at a purely medical, scientific, but actually the humanistic side and the behavioural side to what it means after we get through the clinical trial. Where can we implement that now within the clinical trial to prove that data? That's what I've enjoyed being part of, and throwing the odd curveball in every now and again. I remember the episode when Stephen and I discussed NAFLD to MAFLD, and I said sometimes you need a sledgehammer to open a nut. You just have to do it. It may not be touchy-feely, but it's come a long way since that was pre even going to the nomenclature discussions because of Asia Pacific. I'd like to think that a lot of what we do here, as Stephen has said, is enable delivery to different audiences of where we are. But I wonder where that field would be without surfing the NASH tsunami, and how much information spread and excitement there would be within the field and the topic, and how people would get to know, because we're unique. Our merry band of actors, actresses and warriors.
Yeah, it's a little different. It's a little different. Someone wrote me a note the other day that said this was the best podcast anywhere in medicine. I don't listen to all of them, so I couldn't comment on that. First of all, I'm happy to tell you that nobody has told me that I'm in their head. I hear that about people think like Louise, they think like Stephen, they think like Jörn. Nobody thinks like me, and I think that's probably a good thing. But I will tell you this, in 2020, Stephen, NASH Tech, if I remember right after you presented the Davison paper, we had a brief conversation at Podium where I alluded to the idea that people didn't know enough yet to know really where this issue was. That the Davison paper was the first proof of how bad biopsy was, right? We've had others subsequently. But this whole thing feels so much richer now, so much more nuanced, so much deeper. In fact, one of the two runner-up favorite Stephen phrases was about we are the Wright brothers and we need to be fifth-generation strike fighters. And then today you came up with 8 digits. Can you repeat that, please, so I can write it down so I can have it for the future?
Which one is that?
How we're targeting in the Ukraine.
8-digit grid coordinate. Yeah.
Thank you. I need to write that down so I have it. Actually, in your comment, you also hit the other runner-up in the Stephen drinking game contest, which was about being a work in progress. And the winner, your winner, as compared to Louise's winner, which is you also, was about is the juice worth the squeeze, is the view worth the climb, all those various trade-off metaphors, right?
Sure.
Because I think it's probably the best and most practical question anybody gets to ask. To me, I mean, first of all, 3 years ago, I knew nothing about any of this, and now I know a little.
I think we could all say that.
I think that's right. And I think I knew less then and I know less now, and I'm not saying that with any sense of defensiveness or apology. I think sometimes coming without a perspective helps. But I think you're right. It has gotten so much, every element of this has gotten so much richer. We spend about, every 5th or 6th podcast in some way, shape, or form talking about clinical care pathways and how are we actually going to treat patients and making all this practical. The phrase that I like most coming out of my mouth, although I've been using it a lot recently, comes from Scott Friedman's comment about the yoke of biopsy that I think that I've described as a straitjacket of biopsy, which Donna, bless her, Cryer, says she liked better because biopsy is truly psychotic. But I think when you get away from AI, I think AI has real value. But in so many ways, our view of this disease and how it gets treated and what is success winds up being governed by conditional approval biopsy scores, that we're going to spend years unpacking how to rethink some of these issues in the absence of that stuff.
Stephen Harrison.
And, to the FDA and the EMA's credit, they're forcing that thought process. You're just not going to just come with the idea of the day and have that pivot. Come with data, not just one data set, multiple data sets, not in just Caucasians, but in Hispanics and Asians and everybody else, not just in non-diabetics, but in diabetics, not for just one therapeutic area, but multiple different therapeutic areas, not just for one agent, but combination agent. It's a very thoughtful and deliberate process, and I have to give them credit for that. At the same time, we want to work side by side with them to generate the data we need to answer the questions that need to be answered so that we can pivot to something different that makes more sense. That's, at the end of the day, this is all about patient care. If we're hindering development because we have an archaic tool. And I don't want to say archaic to imply that biopsies aren't important, but we do know the limitations of these biopsies. And there are drugs that could be incredibly helpful in subsets of patients that maybe when you look at them at broad strokes, the signal doesn't rise above the noise as measured by an ordinal score. But yet in very specific subsets of patients, they could be super additive to a backbone therapy. But those drugs were killed because of the blunt instrument we use as an endpoint definition. So I'm a big advocate for having potentially different endpoints for different targets, looking at different outcomes. And I'm a big advocate for combining MACE with MALO. In other words, combining cardiac events with liver events and renal events. I'm a big advocate for having more than one division of the FDA at the table for an end of phase 2 meeting, having cardio-renal, metabolic, and division of hepatology nutrition, breaking down stovepipes and combining endpoints, to me, is the wave of the future, because the ideal NASH drug is not just myopic and fixes the liver. It works on glycemic control and atherogenic lipids and weight, and it does that in a way that not only do we have beneficial impact on the liver and on the heart, but also extrahepatic malignancy, the top 3 killers of a patient with NASH. So I could go on and on about my soapbox.
Jörn Schattenberg.
Something that came to my mind when Stephen said that, I mean, we don't have the optimal tool to identify the patient yet, but we're clearly, through the phase 3 trials, the data we're accumulating and the biomarker programs that are run in there, we're accumulating that data. And if I think of myself and my patient as a treater, I would want the patient to be safe in a disease that in most cases is slowly progressive. So I think there won't be like the tsunami of treatments right in the start. I think we'll start slowly. We'll phenotype the patients and we'll kind of wage in there together and see, do I have a safe compound? Is this the right patient? And then prescribe the drug. I agree with Stephen, it's safety. And then it comes up to, if I'm not convinced, I'm not going to do a biopsy. How is the non-invasive test reacting? Is there additional benefit for the patient in terms of glucose control or lowering lipids or something? And I think that's how we're going to start the treatment here once we get the drugs approved. I don't think everybody's going to go crazy and put everybody on drug that has fatty liver disease. I think for the treaters, at least as far as I see the field, are very aware of the potential weakness of the current identification, the tools, let's say the tools, and we're slowly working our way forward here. So I see the responsibilities being taken up by the physicians to do this safely and identify the right patients. I think many more data will come out once we get the final reports of the large phase 3 trials.
And I think Jörn's got a great point there on the fact that I think it's Quentin that said, when we're talking about all of these euphemisms, it's the fact that perfection is the enemy of good when we talk about liver biopsy. But we're never going to get the perfect tool because we don't have the perfect patient. Every single patient has a different reason for being there and a different set of circumstances. The heterogeneity of NAFLD and NASH is probably beyond doubt the biggest heterogeneity of any disease profile, because you could remove one factor and improve their liver significantly. You could remove the same factor and reduce it in somebody else and have no effect. So we're trying to find the needle in the haystack for the needle in the haystack. That's really, really difficult to do. And a liver biopsy doesn't account in any way, shape or form for each of those different types. It's a pure generalization. So perfection is the enemy of good on a lot of areas. Was it Scott or was it somebody else said that any other disease would be looking really happily at success rates of 89% and things for diagnostics, and yet we're considering those not high enough. Like the guys have said, we're never going to find the perfect tool or the perfect solution, but we need to find something that has that broad range that targets, and then you can get your laser fighter in certain areas for different, because everybody's going to need something slightly different, even with drugs approved in a very broad range.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. Creating and fostering this podcast over the past 3 years, and in the process getting to know the fatty liver community, has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my professional life. We all want to express our deepest gratitude to the thousands of you who have downloaded our episodes, and particularly those who have shared your stories or reactions with us over time. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. Next week, we will be joined by French endocrinologist Cyril Kelsey for a fantastic discussion of the intersections between endocrinology and hepatology, looking at issues ranging from clinical research to care pathways. The NASH Tsunami team is really excited about this discussion, and you should be as well. So, until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.